My brother and I have a stern father, and he has gotten more detached after our mother passed away. Over the years, my older brother Joe has been less and less supportive and took over for being the family asshole. I know he doesn't want to be as close as we have been seeing he's getting older. Yet, he always needs me to do simple activities for him. Joe is 15 years old, hot-headed, and thinks he knows everything now. He takes me for granted that I will cover for him if he ever makes a mistake. By contrast, I'm a few years younger and am on the smaller side. The only thing we share a love for is the supernatural, magic, and spiritualism. It's one of those things that helped us bond over Mom passing away, and a way to plot against our dad. One day, Joe found a few books at the library book drive and couldn't wait until we were cleaning up the kitchen after our dad left for the night. I haven't seen Joe so pumped up since watching our first horror movie 2 years ago. Those ladies didn't know what they were throwing away, Joe said in hushed tones. If I read it right, it can show how to summon a Jinn and other creatures from the other world. Joe looked at me for a moment, then shaking his head, said, "This Jinn has the power to grant a wish, but wants an offer in return. Get it now." I got it, and was even excited to read it, but Joe raised his hands for me to stop talking. "I gotta get through most of the hard stuff in practice. I need you to cover for me for the chores for a few days while I study it," Joe said. "Well, when will I get to read it?" I asked, already annoyed that he was passing the buck. "Look, you can have the books after chores," he said, folding the towel to dry the dishes. "You want to do this or not?" I did, but made it clear that I was having full access to the books, or I wasn't cleaning anything. He dropped the towel on the kitchen counter and was gone before the word deal was out of his mouth. I'll give it to Joe. He was pretty dedicated to reading all of the books he was able to score from the library. He even went back the following day to see if any more old books were available to buy. He emptied most of his savings and hit me up for my allowance to make sure all related material was purchased before some book reseller ever crossed his path. Each time our father would come home and eat, he would either retreat up to his room or roll out of the house. By the time he got home, he was pretty well drunk and took out his anger. The few times he came home, he found the kitchen and bathroom wasn't clean enough and wore us up to a belt strap and large buckle windmilling in the room. Each time we got the rude awakening, Joe would point at me about who was at fault. Never took the blame for any of the slight, just threw me under the bus. I couldn't get to sleep on those nights, but started to reread the ritual and the terms of the agreement with the Jinn, or any spirit you want to do a deal with. The wording for those agreements are very specific, and it took me a few times to understand what they ask is often not what they are meaning. Even if the language is similar to what you speak, the words don't translate well. "Joe," I told him while our dad was out at the bar, "when you enter the bargain, you have to start a different way each time. You can't just make demands. You have to offer. You don't know what you're saying. You need to focus on cleaning the house spotless this time. You need to keep Dad off my back for the next 2 days. I can't be disturbed right now," Joe said. "Here it is. I'm taking a beating because you're not keeping the house clean." "I've been taking the heat for the house for the last week," I told him. "I could use some help here." "I want to do a test run this Saturday." Joe waved me off. "After the test drive, I'll help, but keep the old man happy. Cook something easy and just let me handle this." "Joe," I growled and was tired and grouchier than normal. Joe looked at me and thought for a second. "Ugh," Joe sighed. "I think I can pull it off. We'll do it when Dad leaves for the night." By the time Saturday came, my head was spinning with all the small details that the books say to do and double meaning for most of the ritual. We had a light spaghetti dinner. When I was thinking that our father would go out, he just went upstairs. After an hour, we heard the TV and some light snoring. "We can go to North Park," Joe whispered. "We'll take a power nap and leave around midnight. You need to make sure the house is spotless before we go." I grumbled, but agreed. Joe went to take a rest while I started to empty the trash and work on the bathroom. After the chores, I was too worked up to take any type of rest. I started to check the room and my notes on my phone to make sure of everything we needed to bring and key points we needed to be careful to say. I saved most of that information on my phone and waited, reading the books while my brother snored. I woke Joe around midnight and we gathered our backpacks with what was needed. It would be about a 30-minute walk, and I decided to just use the bathroom before leaving. The park was unpopular for a lot of reasons. Even though we lived in a mostly quiet suburban city, there were rumors about drug deals going down. A few times we walked through backyards just to make sure we avoided being followed by the police cruiser working the night shift. We walked in silence the entire time. Once Joe found a clearing he liked, still pitch black and obscured by trees. We started to set up. He would whisper instructions, and I reached in quickly and started to assemble everything. I created a standard summoning circle wide enough to include everything we need. Then I created a smaller Ptolemy redaction circle, so Joe would be able to be close to the Jinn with an additional measure of protection. I created for myself something called a Bartimaeus respite, careful to recreate it exactly as pictured. I had hardly had time to close the circles and prep the candles before giving the books a final once-over and jumped into the circle. "Joe," I was hoarse and whispered slightly, "you have to bless your circle first." He waved at me again and cleared his throat and began his introductory summonings chant. I blessed the main circle and then my own, watching Joe start his warm-up requests. When the wind picked up and sputtered, I saw Joe get excited. I was starting to think about how things started to come alive. The candles we brought flickered and emitted a foul smoke as they burned. I noticed Joe started to rapidly go through the supplication chants instead of layering them one by one and waiting for an appropriate response. From what I recall, you can't just speed through this to get to the actual main event. There were rules, and Joe, like always, was speeding through and doing things his own way. There was a deep rumble under where we stood, and the flames of the candles dimmed dramatically. They didn't go out, but it was as if the dimmer switch was turning the flames down to a tiny dot of fire. When the wind picked up again, the smoke filled the tree lines and the night skyline and swirled. In a tree line cloaked in shadows, where the veil between realms was thin and arcane forces wove their eerie patterns, a Jinn emerged from the sparks and smoke of the candles. The air tasted like cigar smoke, and I could have wet my pants when I saw what my brain did not want to believe. As the smoke rippled like a darkened pool, a figure materialized above, an embodiment of darkness and malevolence. The Jinn's form was a twisted silhouette, its outline shifting and undulating as though formed of smoke and nightmares. Its skin, a deep indigo abyss, absorbed the faint glimmers of light reflected from the light pollution of the sidewalks about a mile away, leaving only the faintest traces of eerie luminescence along the edges of its shape. The Jinn's eyes burned like twin stars in the void, white orbs embedded within its shadowy visage. They pierced through the darkness, fixing their gaze upon Joe, who it was assumed was the one who had called upon its power. It looked at Joe, cocked its massive head, then over to me. His eyes narrowed, then he looked at Joe again. For a long moment, it said nothing. The genie's limbs were elongated, its fingers tapering into points like the talons of a predator. As it rose, the air seemed to curl and twist around it, as if recoiling from its presence. Its movements were sinuous and deliberate, each gesture a calculated display of dominance over both the physical and the ethereal. "Make the offer," I whispered to Joe, hoping to snap him out of his trance. What happened next made me question how my brother even had a brain to begin with. "I want you to destroy my father," Joe started to bark out loud. "I want you to wipe him from the earth." The Jinn's eyes went wide, and then he turned his large head towards me. His torso descended slightly inhaled. Impudence and ignorance, lackluster influence, treacherous tongue, no malice. The Jinn's voice was breathy, smooth, and beguiling. I heard the words and could read the intent, judging by his facial expression. Before I knew what happened, Joe was lifted into the air, shaking and choking as he rose to the height of a basketball rim. I could barely make out Joe's features when the Jinn started to wrap his large hands around his frame and start to squeeze the life out of Joe. "Be swift and hold," I heard my voice call out. I hadn't wanted to jump into the ritual, but seeing my brother being squeezed like a grape opened my mouth. I was intending to scream, to yell, "Let my brother go," but my mouth had a mind of its own. "Lean into me. Lean close." The Jinn looked down at me with a renewed interest. He held Joe, but stopped squeezing for the moment. "Be quick," the Jinn said, more shyly than when it had appeared. I rest not." "An offer for your favor," I started getting bolder as I spoke. We offer a mortal for the means to a power." The Jinn was silent for a moment. This one bargains, but no offers. He turned his head to Joe, who had fainted at this point. This one, turning to me, offers and bargains much. The means to power is forever and expensive. "What is that price?" I asked, already regretting opening my mouth. This one, the Jinn's large head tilted to Joe. And this one, the Jinn raised a second hand, palm up. Above his palm was an image of a sleeping man that was my father, sleeping off a serious hangover. "So be it," I said, no longer thinking about what I was saying. "It is done," the Jinn said. The next face it made was at Joe, when he shook his hand once and woke my brother. He roused from sleep, still kicking his feet in the air, and saw the skin of the spirit creature. The Jinn's face broke into a wide smile, showing 2 rows of sharp, yellow teeth. It roared like a large bobcat, a mixture of raw power and controlled intensity. The roar's very essence was of the wilderness channeled through the Jinn's vocal cords. Joe opened his mouth to scream, but the crunch of bones and a whoosh of air stopped all movement. A brilliant green puff of smoke took both Joe and the Jinn away from sight and back into the other world, the ether. That was the cloak between this world and the spiritual one. There were no lights and no other sounds in the park. I wanted to yell for Joe, but didn't draw any attention to myself. My only thought was to get home. I looked for my bag and saw that they were already packed and waiting. I thought about the sand and salt used to build the pentagrams and protection circle, and saw that the evidence was cleared and no longer visible. I blessed the area that I was standing in, but saw that circle was also gone. I half ran, half jogged home, hoping that Joe would be fast asleep. I was hoping that my dad would be still snoring and the TV on a high volume. When I got to my street, there were sirens blaring and people standing around. I didn't dare get close to see what was happening. I stayed in the shadows, watching the fire department hose down the front and rear of our house. I started to think about what excuses I could come up with. What could I possibly tell the police where I was when the house caught fire? I stepped back into the darkness of the block, making myself as small as possible, blending between cars, shrubs, and oak trees littering the sidewalk. I turned the corner from where I had come, keeping my head down and avoiding the street lights, and I kept walking.